Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
In other words, for Gandhi, the real drive in life is self-realization, because the great human problem is not emptiness, but it's illusion.
Today on Reflections, Father Bacik talks with Dr. Rama Pulagandli, who is a professor of philosophy at the University of Toledo. The topic of this week's Reflections is Mohandas Gandhi, the search for self-realization. And now, here is Father Bacik.
Rama, one of the reasons I like to talk to you is because you represent a different tradition and culture. Your background in India, your knowledge of Hinduism and world religions. And I think it's important for us in the Western world at times to encounter other cultures, because it's so easy for us to end up thinking our way of thinking, our sense of reality, our way of doing things is the only way. We're very successful materially in the Western world. Our technology and our science has given us a preeminent position. We are a world power here in the United States, and it's easy for us to end up thinking that our way is the only way, and we end up in what I might call a cultural cocoon, cut off from the rest of the world. So I always find it interesting to talk to people like you, because you represent another viewpoint, another worldview, a different cultural perspective, and I find that to be very helpful. I would think that you would have had to go through that a little bit yourself in coming to the United States and teaching here. You had to sort of embrace another culture. You're a man who's lived in two different cultures and two different worlds. Yes. I don't know if you want to comment on that at all or not.
No, yes, I will make a brief comment. Yes, it's quite interesting, and in my own judgment, I wish, more people, have had that kind of experience, to live in more than one culture and one tradition. That way, it would become possible for a person, of course, to benefit from the best of both traditions. Yes. Of course, when a person moves from one culture and one tradition to live in another culture or tradition, one has to come there, with an open mind in the first place. Yes, these people have something to teach me. There are some ways, in which, they do things, which are definitely far better, of course, than the ways in which, people do things elsewhere, So
every culture has its strengths and weaknesses as well.
Absolutely, yes. So when one comes with that positive attitude and an open mind, I think, it contributes a great deal, for the growth and for the development of the person himself or
And you wish more people would have that kind of experience. Can I ask how old you were when you came to the United States?
When I came here, I was 27.
So you were deeply rooted in the Indian culture and tradition.
I was a young person, yes. Deeply rooted in the sense, I was born and brought up there.
Yes.
But of course...
And did your studies there?
Studies. And since, of course, I come from an interesting kind of background and so on and so forth, I was quite, well-versed in the history and of Western culture and Western tradition.
Sure.
Yes,
To begin with.
Sure, yes. So,
and that helped you to understand
absolutely, So, for example, long before I came here, I knew the history of the United States, or the history of England, for example, and, so on and so forth. So when I came here, yes, but certainly, you will find, some important cultural differences. I sincerely mean it when I say that, more people should have that kind of opportunities to live in more, not just going and visiting for 10 days or 15 days. No, that won't do any good, it's not long enough time, for something to have a lasting influence, But if you live there for a good while, then you try to get the best of both.
Well, what I want to do now, Rama, is talk a little about Mohandas Gandhi, a figure that who is fascinating to both of us, and I find to be a good bridge figure. In other words, I find it in my own reading of Gandhi and my studies of him is that it's a way to get into another culture. It's a way to encounter a man who was at home in various worlds and who knew how to be open-minded while retaining his own convictions. And so I see Gandhi as a bridge between East and West, and I see a reading of Gandhi by Westerners as a way of getting into the Eastern mind and being challenged. So I want to look at Mohandas Gandhi in a particular way here, and especially his notions of self-realization. Now let me begin by playing it off of the Western view of this. I think in the Western world, the characteristic phrase and the thing that we're interested in want to do, we often call self-fulfillment. We think of ourselves as being incomplete in one way or another, as being empty, perhaps, and the great job in life is to get fulfillment. You get that by expanding your experiences, by acquiring more things, by, in one way or another, often forming healthy relationships, thus completing oneself sexually, so that we have a notion of self-fulfillment as our ideal. It gets refined, it takes different forms. Sometimes we'll talk about self-actualization and so on. But fundamentally, fulfillment's a good word because we think of ourselves as incomplete and we need more. Right. That's the root human problem, is that we are incomplete or empty, and now how do we fulfill ourselves, complete ourselves, get integration, fill up the emptiness? Now, what interests me about Gandhi is that he had a very different outlook on this whole question. In other words, for Gandhi, the real drive in life is self-realization, because the great human problem is not emptiness, but it's illusion. It's the failure to see the truth accurately. It's to be involved in self-deception. And so, therefore, we get a great drive in Gandhi to talk about self-realization, to come to greater truth and insight. So I'd like to play with that idea a little bit now and to see where you might want to go with it and what chords that strikes inside of your own psyche here. You want to comment at all about his notion of self-realization and how he saw it?
Yeah, I agree with you in the first place. I mean, that it is a very worthwhile point, I mean, to discuss. By clarifying the notion of self-fulfillment on the one hand, and that of self-realization on the other, and as you pointed out, to bring into clear focus, I mean, the contrast, I mean, between these two notions, and why Gandhi placed emphasis upon that of self-realization. You have clarified it very nicely, but since you asked me to make a comment,
go ahead.
if I may
Please.
further clarify it, not of course, I mean, it's controverting what we have said.
No.
Yeah, fulfillment means, I mean, as of now, I am not full, I lack something, I am incomplete or whatever, and therefore, of course, I mean, there are certain things I need to do, there are certain things I need to acquire, be they material goods or human relations or whatever, all those things, I mean, in order that I may be fulfilled. Yeah. So the whole concept of self-fulfillment, it presupposes, of course, I mean, a state of not yet fulfilled. Right. Self-realization means there is nothing to be fulfilled. We do not lack anything. We already are, of course, I mean, fully the self. It's only a question of our realizing such to be the case.
The illusion would be that we're incomplete in one sense. Yeah,
as you
that's the illusion. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So so there is a very real sense in which you were quite correct. I mean, in saying that Gandhi perhaps, I mean, inherited that tradition. I mean, that notion from the tradition, because the idea of illusion and the idea of ignorance, avidya, as we say, not knowing what we are, you know, they're already present, of course. I mean, they're pervasive in the tradition from which Gandhi comes. Okay? Whereas, this is the point I want to make, in the Western tradition, to the best of my knowledge and belief, I mean, the idea of course, I mean, individuals as separate units, as separate selves, you know, and each self, of course, I mean, has to do the fulfilling.
Yes.
And therefore, here, the individual does things to fulfill himself or herself and so on and so forth. Whereas there, the self, the individual self is acknowledged, of course, I mean, in the Indian tradition, but it is not, of course, I mean, the ultimate reality. As ultimate reality, as self, Atman or Brahman, as Gandhi would say, we are already that.
Yeah.
It's only a question of course, I mean, our having to realize such to be the case.
Let me go back to the traditional phrase you use, which I think is Atman is Brahman, right?
Atman is
An
Brahman.
identification. Atman, which suggests the self,
Atman is pure consciousness.
right,
Not the
is
ego.
Brahman, which is the absolute reality.
That's
In other words, what you're saying is, in the Indian tradition, that the self is really included in the whole already. It's an illusion to think that you are an isolated
I am
individual.
somehow different. In fact,
Yeah.
it is the crowning achievement in the Hindu tradition is to come to realize, I am Brahman. Aham Brahmasmi. I am Brahman.
Yes.
And
And
then
then also there's what they call often in the mystical traditions in the East is the oceanic feeling. You are like the drop in the ocean, which now becomes simply part of the ocean.
Yes. Or if you go to Maestro Eckhart
That's right, from the Western tradition,
you say,
right?
That thou art.
Yes.
Tattvam asi. That's what Upanishad says. Tattvam asi.
Tatvam asi.
Tattvam asi.
Yeah, translate that for us.
Tat means-
Tatvam asi.
Tat means that. Tvam, you. Asi means is. Or. That you are.
That you are. That's the great insight that
You
you
are
must
Brahman.
achieve.
I
You
am
are Brahman. Atman is Brahman. The
Brahman.
self really is identified with the whole.
I am Brahman. Aham Brahmasmi. Aham means I.
Yes.
I am Brahman.
And you were alluding also to a great Western mystic, Meister Eckhart,
That's what
who
I said.
comes the closest to the Eastern world, who also saw the self as being immersed in the all.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
This that thou art is directly from it.
Yes. Yeah. So we have here an explanation of this self-realization in a sort of metaphysical terms, philosophical terms. Now let's try to get a hold of what this means in action and more maybe a psychological approach. I guess part of that means that what we really need to do is to reduce our inflated ego. Or to reduce our empirical self to zero.
Correct.
You must get rid of egoism in order to find happiness in life. That'd be another way of saying this. I mean, how do you find happiness? You can find happiness in acquiring goods, or getting more things, or expanding relationships, or do you acquire happiness by reducing the ego and through a life of self-service and so on. And I think that's what Gandhi's great emphasis there is. We must reduce the inflated ego. Do you want to say more about that?
Yes,
How you see that?
It is this identification. I remember in your essay on Gandhi, you pointed out quite nicely the one's not just empathy, one's identification, of course, with the wretched, the poor, the have-nots, the dispossessed, the downtrodden, one, it comes again, of course, from the fountainhead of mystical wisdom. That means mystic, I've understood how he who sees himself in all, right, and all in himself.
Yeah. So the mystics always see sort of an undifferentiated unity. They see things in unified terms. The mystics of both East and the West
Oh, yes.
Have that same sort of insight.
Yes,
That
yeah.
the illusion is that we are just separated and there's no bonding connecting us. And
Right.
the mystics see beneath the differences to see the similarities and to see the
And the
common
identity.
bonding.
In fact, in the Indian tradition, and of course, at the highest mystical level in Western tradition, they will agree. It's not just a similarity, it is thoroughgoing identity.
Yes.
Yeah. See, and in other words, therefore, we will be able to attain this knowledge of this identity, realization, as you have pointed out. What stands in the way of our realizing this? Of course, as you correctly pointed out, what stands is egoism, attachment to things.
Yeah.
That's why Gandhi says, we should possess least. We should not go after, of course, grabbing things. Because the idea is nothing brings us permanent satisfaction.
Yes. Yeah, that's well put, and I think that's where I see the corrective. In other words, Gandhi is talking to an acquisitive culture here. I mean, he's saying if we let him address us, we have an acquisitive culture. We think that we're always going to run out of everything, and we have to have more of in order to be happy. And Gandhi's saying, no, you don't do that. You have to have less. And Gandhi, of course, lived that way himself. He had a very simple lifestyle.
Very simple lifestyle.
He ate very simply and had very few possessions, and it demonstrated this in his own life. Do you want to comment more on
this
that?
is not to say, I want to make that distinction, in light of your comment. I mean, being acquisitive is one thing. There is nothing wrong, of course, with our producing food, medicine, cloth to people, and so on. There's nothing wrong with it.
Yes.
What is wrong is, of course, to be gluttonous, to possess more and more and more, thinking that somehow it would bring us enduring happiness.
Yeah. It's an attitude we take towards the material possessions that could be out of bounds. As you said, a gluttonous attitude, right?
Yeah. Material goods in themselves, there is nothing wrong with it. There's nothing wrong with it. We need food in another half an hour, and we enjoy food sumptuously and nicely. There's nothing wrong with it. What is wrong, of course, is to hoard food when there are so many people who are hungry in the street.
Yeah. I was thinking, Rama, on this idea of ego reduction. That's also a very common phrase in Western popular psychology these days. The idea of reducing the ego or getting to the true self. I use an example as Thomas Merton, the monk, Trappist monk, and he talked a lot about getting from the false self to the true self, of moving from the empirical self to the true self, and that he saw it very much as a religious quest, but so did Gandhi, and I think that's another link-up, because Gandhi saw this as the way to come closer to God. And as a matter of fact, this is what he said one time, his great encompassing passion, he said, what he was about in life, and what I think he thought other people should be about, was to achieve self-realization, and I'm quoting now, to see God face to face, to attain salvation. In other words, he thought salvation came, wholeness, completeness, from self-realization.
Correct.
And what was it? It was to see God face to face. And I think he saw God, therefore, as the great helper, as he called him one time. God was the helper who would enable us to come to this self-realization. We could rely on God, and we didn't have to rely so much on our own power or on our own egos.
Exactly.
It seems to me that's part of what he's trying to get at. God is the omnipotent one, the helper who can really enable us to control ourselves so that we can get this greater self-realization.
Oh, yes. And how does one serve God? When Gandhi was asked, he said many, many times, by serving man.
Yes.
Yes. There is no God, hiding somewhere, waiting to be served. You serve man, and thus, thereby, you serve God.
So my own teacher, Carl Rahner, always said the same thing, that there was an essential link between love of neighbor and love of God. That you really couldn't have one. And of course, that's a biblical insight, but he's trying to say it in contemporary terms, that you simply can't separate it out in such a way that if you do love your neighbor, you already love God, even if you don't name it that way, even if you don't mention God's name, even if you don't say a prayer, even if you're not a believer, Rahner says, an explicit believer. If you love your neighbor, you're already loving God, because God is in the neighbor. And because those two loves are inextricably woven together.
Yes.
And I think that is the same thing that Gandhi really is saying here.
Oh, yes. In fact, I don't exactly remember now, who said this. One of my friends in a discussion, Christianity, Christ, taught, exhorted people, love your neighbor, as yourself.
Yes. And
the Upanishads, gave a reason as to why you should do that.
And the reason is?
Your neighbor is yourself.
Yes. Well, of course, you get the same thing in the Gospels, Ram. You get with Jesus saying you are to feed the hungry and give drink to the thirsty, and in Matthew 25, and then the answer is, well, why is this? Because Jesus identifies himself with those people. If you fed the hungry and gave thirsty to drink to the thirsty, you've done that to Jesus, because Jesus has already identified himself with those people who are in need.
Right.
So you get that same sort of notion within the New Testament.
Yes, the point I'm trying to make is slightly different. Yes, I understand the point you are making, how it comes in the New Testament. It comes through Jesus, as you explained.
Yes. Right.
Whereas, for the Hindu Upanishad tradition from which Gandhi comes, the neighbor is Brahman.
Yes. Atman is Brahman. The self is...
And there is just Brahman. There are not many Brahmans. just Brahman.
Yeah.
Because the neighbor and myself, we are identical in our ultimate.
Yes. And that
reality.
becomes, as you well point out, in the Hindu tradition, that becomes the real basis then for identifying that.
And what is most interesting, and the Buddha pointed out that someone went and asked, well, the Buddha said, are you capable of loving yourself? He asked him one day. The fellow looked around and said, well, I'm not very sure. Then the Buddha said, if you cannot love yourself, you cannot love others. So you should first learn how to love yourself.
Love the self first, yes.
Yes.
And as we say it, and in our tradition again, you must love your neighbor as yourself. Right.
So if you cannot love yourself, you can't love your neighbor.
Yes. Rama, there's other things that Gandhi suggested here that we should do in trying to get this self-realization, and we just mentioned them at least. He did think that regular prayer was important, and I think he did that in his ashrams. They prayed 3 times a day, I believe, and used different religious traditions to do that.
Yes.
So the regular prayer is a means to achieving self-realization. In fact, he thought it would help us then to listen to the inner voice, that there was the inner divine voice inside, and if we were prayerful, quiet, meditating, reflecting, we could hear that voice, and it would help us to cut through illusion, get to the truth, and achieve self-realization.
Yeah.
Also, then he talked about the importance of having the virtues like humility, which would keep you open to correction. If you were humble and someone gives you honest criticism, you could change and see things better, and also cut through the illusion and get the self-realization.
Yeah, because as you said, humility goes with, cutting down the egoism.
Cutting down the egoism.
Yes.
Yes, right. And then he also talked about the importance of fortitude, having courage, because if we're going to have self-realization, we're going to have to go against peer pressure sometimes.
Oh, yes.
And against the ordinary way the crowd is thinking.
Yes.
We must think for ourselves and see life whole and so on.
Sometimes you take positions, which are not popular. For example, I still remember, as kids, we used to see in movie houses, during intermissions, they will have slides, and Gandhi, they used to have a slide. I would rather see Hinduism die and go out of existence than live with untouchability.
That was in the movie theater?
They will show it, for public advertisements, for public announcements, no?
Yeah, now tell me that again. It would say...
I would rather see Hinduism die and vanish away altogether than live with untouchability.
Oh, they then live with a class system based on the untouchables. Yeah, I see what you mean. This is Gandhi speaking, huh?
Yeah, that means they will show it.
Yeah, I get it.
It's like for us to see. Yeah.
Okay, so the point that you remembered here is the untouchables were the lower class, and you were not to associate with them, and Gandhi thought we had to overcome that whole system, right, the caste system.
Well, he fought untouchability tooth and nail.
Yeah.
He said, he would rather see Hinduism disappear from the face of the earth than exist with untouchability.
Right.
But you see, that's a view which did not sit well with some of the traditional Orthodox
people.
But he took the position and stood by it.
Yeah.
Look, I have nothing to compromise, nothing to apologize for. I'm sorry.
A powerful message, Yeah.
And even the untouchables, he gave a different name for them. He called them Hari Jan. Hari means God. Jana means children, people.
God's children.
People of the Lord.
Yes, tell me the phrase again.
Hari Jan.
Hari Jan.
Hari means Lord.
Yes.
Jana means people.
Yes.
Harijan means people of the Lord.
Harijan,
children of God, people of the Lord.
That's interesting. In other words, he named them differently. Let's not call them the untouchables. We'll call them the children of God. God's people.
Yes.
Sure. Gandhi was very a clever man that way. He understood how language worked. He understood how symbols worked.
He started a magazine, a newspaper called Harijan in 1913. Yes.
In order to make his point.
Oh, it is through that he fought.
Yeah, right. It's how successful was he with that? We're going to get a field here. I'm going to take you a field.
Quite successful. I think India has done quite well.
Yeah.
I am not saying that it has completely disappeared.
Yes.
But it has disappeared, of course, from the major cities, urban areas, and so on and so forth. But it still persists, of course, in rural areas.
In the rural areas. And among the more uneducated people.
It takes some time.
Yeah. But it definitely, the seeds are sown for overcoming it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And also,
in
the law.
And Gandhi gets the credit for really moving it in that direction.
The main reason for it.
Yes. That's wonderful.
To make an issue and, really work at it. How to eliminate its root and branch.
Again, we can put this in maybe a more religious framework. That I would say that you're going to achieve self-realization primarily through service of others, through serving the country, to making the country better, towards charity to all other people, and as you've well pointed out, especially towards the untouchables. But in the midst of all of that, it's really our way of coming closer to God, because God is found in all of that. And I think that really becomes essential to the whole mix. Well, Rama, as always, when I talk with you, we could talk forever about these topics, and it's too bad you're not on television with all your gestures and everything that goes with your language. It's wonderful. And the enthusiasm you bring to the discussion, I really appreciate. I guess what we wanted to try to see today was that notion of Mohandas Gandhi, great 20th century figure, as teaching us something about self-realization, and that he sees that as the great ideal of life. Cut through illusion, see yourself truly. How are you going to do it? Prayer, yes, but especially service of others. And if we're serving others, then we're going to come to see who we are and who God is. And I'm saying that is a great corrective to Western thought when we're overly competitive, overly acquisitive, too materialistic. Gandhi speaking to us and saying, no, there's another way. Get in touch with the truth. Achieve it through this self-realization, which will bring you closer to God.
You've been listening to Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo. Today on Reflections, Father Bacik talked with Dr. Rama Puligandli, who is a professor of philosophy at the University of Toledo. The topic of this week's Reflections was Mohandas Gandhi, the search for self-realization. If there are any comments on this week's show or suggestions for future programs, please write. Father James Bacik, Catholic Campus Ministry, 2086 Brookdale Drive, Toledo, Ohio, 43606. Funding for this program was provided by the Catholic Communications Commission of the Diocese of Toledo.